You're listening to the Penteract Poetry Podcast, hosted by Anthony Etherin.
So this is episode 32, and I'm talking to Tom Jenks, and this is part of the launch for Pack My Box with 5 dozen liquor jugs. I always get the name wrong, so I got it right that time. Yeah.
You did, yeah. I sometimes substitute box for trunk for box, which would, as we'll discuss, would invalidate the whole premise of the book.
Yeah. So, Tom, we've met once before, and obviously we've been working together on this book, but it's nice to meet you properly so we can sit down and have a proper conversation. And the thing I normally begin these interviews with, which I've warned you about in advance, is I'd like some origin story. Why? Because sometimes I wonder why anybody would want to be a poet, even though I am myself a poet. It seems like a strange choice.
It is. In some ways, it's not really a choice, is it? It's just something that you do and you keep on doing. And you suddenly reach your 40s, late 40s like I am now, and you're still doing it. You think, well, how did that happen? Exactly. So it's a good question how I started. I think I really came to it via music, via song lyrics. In my teens, at some point I probably became more interested in the lyrics, or as interested in the lyrics as the music. I was very into the Smiths back then. That was when you could still be into the Smiths without being cancelled. And that's obviously very lyrical, lyrics are very important. It's the fall and all sorts of things. And I suppose that put me on a more literary path. I always sort of had the idea I was going to write song lyrics, which I did, but then I never had anybody to write music with. So I suppose they were poems, really. And I kept on doing it, really. I suppose I started to think more of myself as a poet maybe in my early 20s, when I used to listen to the Mark Radcliffe radio shows, sort of early 90s. There was quite a lot of poetry on there. And I began to sort of just get more and more interested in that. And I wrote in isolation for quite some time, really. I was sending out to magazines and things like that. I eventually got into quite a few, did quite well. I didn't do any readings or anything, or really know anybody else who was writing poetry. So it's something that I just did, and I've just kept on doing. But I suppose in answer to your question, it would come through song lyrics, really, I would say, and then that developed from there. Obviously, doing something like this book that we're going to talk about here is quite a long way from that, but in some ways it isn't. It's still to do with language and the pleasure of making things out of language, which I think is what it's all about.
Yeah, I've talked on this podcast before about how I got started, which was, again, it was through song lyrics, but not because I wanted to write the lyrics. I was more a musician, and I had to write lyrics. And then the lyrics sort of took over, but I didn't like writing them when I didn't have the structure behind me of the music. Yeah, which is why I then gravitated towards formal poetry. And after
so you've got a different sort of structure. Yeah.
But so you were writing free verse.
Yeah, I was just writing. I was just just writing anything, really. Not even really thinking about what I was doing. I suppose like you, I was sort of writing with music in mind, but without any particular means to make the music myself. So that was the model. There was the models that I had. So in a sense, there was a structure there.
Yeah. Also, there's melody in your head.
I don't know. I mean, I think what poetry was sort of distinguished. People who write novels and short stories get very angry when I say things like this, but I think poetry is more language for its own sake, I think, and rhythm, sound. It's non-functional, I think, poetry in some ways. Certainly the sort of poetry that say you and I are interested in more, I would say, is less to do with saying something than it is with being something. And I suppose, I would never have thought about it in those terms back then. I suppose I was always thinking about it in musical sound, colour, textual terms, rather than actually sort of conveying anything in particular, which I suppose is what's characterised my work, certainly as an adult, since it's not really been concerned with saying anything or getting anything across in particular. I don't know how you feel about it, because obviously, I would say you're much more in depth with your involvement with constraints than I am. And I've heard you talk on this podcast about how you're quite happy to lose meaning, so or meaning for meaning to be the first thing to go, that you're sort of interested in sound and musicality, really. And I think I'm probably not quite as far along that path as you, but I feel the same too. It's always the sort of it's the sound of things, and the sort of the colours almost, and the textures it creates before you even think about what it means. I think sort of working with constraints like in this book, it does sort of foreground that, doesn't it? It does sort of move you away from trying to say something. You're so occupied with trying to follow some rules that then you can let the rest of the things that language does just happen.
Yeah, and this is why I think it's similar to visual poetry, where the shape is important the same way the sound is important in constraint, and of course the form itself. What most people think of as poetry is the shape and the sound and the form of a poem there to help support the meaning and the feeling. Whereas in the sort of poetry I like, the small objects of meaning and feeling are there as slaves to the form, the shape, and the sound.
Yes.
So really, it's the opposite of what I think most people think poetry is, because of what most people are told poetry is.
Yeah, I think it does sort of colour people's approaches to it, doesn't it? I mean, something like John Ashbery, for example, you can never work out what John Ashbery meant. John Ashbery didn't know what John Ashbery meant, I don't think. So that's sort of something that you just watch happen, isn't it? I think there's some literature where you just watch it, don't you? You just sort of it's there in front of you.
Yeah, and if you find meaning in it, good, but
yeah,
you don't have to.
No.
Yeah. Although I do go back and forth. I think sometimes I want to write something more lyrical, still using the constraints, but holding back a bit and leaning more towards meaning. And I think there's always that back and forth, that we're exploring a territory between full-on constraints and full-on asemic visual poetry, and on the other hand, traditional poetry. I mean, do you feel that? Do you feel like you're going between different states?
Yeah, I think though. So I can sort of see lyricism in your work, but I mean, I don't know whether you ever get past the voice and the self, do you? I mean, if you look at people that sort of explored this very thoroughly, Cage, Jackson McLowe, people like that, they sort of talk about how you can't really escape yourself, no matter what prison you put yourself in, no matter what constraints you set yourself. Your voice is always there. And I suppose even with this book here that Catherine and I have written, that we're talking about tonight, which is obviously very heavily rule based, I still find I can still pick it up and I think, well, I could spot her writing, and I could spot my own, I think. So perhaps we can, I think a lot of poetry is very, very concerned about voice and forming voice, and a lot of conceptions of poetry rather very concerned about voice and finding voice and maintaining voice. But I think it's just there, isn't it? And it's there no matter what you do. So if you have that sort of lyrical aspect to your sensibility, I think no matter what difficult task you set yourself, it's that lyricism still going to be there. Yeah,
you can't hide it. And
no, I don't think you can do anything about it.
Well, one thing that marks a lot of your work is humour. It's this quirky, zany sense of humour. Is that something you've always done?
Well, no, I've always been interested in humour. I think in my family, humour's quite prized. When I was growing up, it was just that was the way you interacted with each other. It was making each other laugh was an important part of the family dynamic. So I've always been interested in humour, always been interested in comedy. But it took me a while to let it in, really. I think there are certain problems with how it's perceived in poetry. If you write poetry that is funny, you are putting yourself in a category that's probably down the food chain a bit, in some ways. You sort of like you're shading into light verse or that sort of thing. But for me, that's just my voice. It's just how I see the world. It's how I would talk in everyday life. And I think my sort of journey, if you can use that loaded word, over the years, has been trying to sort of let poetry just be what I would be like normally. Not sort of have this different rarefied things that you write about, ways that you write about them. Just that however you talk in real life, however you think in real life, let that in.
Yeah.
I did have a phase where I sort of wrote sort of like flash fiction and sort of more comic stories, but I never put it in the poetry because it just didn't seem to belong there. But then at some point I thought, well, why doesn't it belong there? You know, poetry should be, everything belongs in poetry, I think, you know. So it wasn't a conscious decision, I suppose. It's just I stopped keeping it out, I think, rather than deliberately putting it in.
That's interesting, because there's something about constraints, especially what I do, palindromes, for example. There's sort of an expectation that these are meant to be, that it's just wordplay and it's just fun and it's meant to be light and humorous. And I think for a long time I resisted that, and I thought, no, I'm going to show people that it can be serious poetry. And so I was intent on that. But over the last few years, I've decided, no, I'm just going to embrace this a bit more, and I will allow it to be silly.
Yeah. So that's something you feel comfortable doing? You feel comfortable being silly?
Well, it's something I mean, as you say, with your own journey, that you learn to accept that, rather than try and fight against it, and rather than try to have this idea of I am a serious poet, I demand to be taken seriously, so I'm going to leave out all these sillier parts of my nature. And after a while, it just feels pointless and artificial. And you know, why not embrace the silliness? And
do you think people are glad to find it sometimes? I think if you're ever at a reading and, you know, maybe you're at an open mic or something, or any of these things you do, and there's lots of stuff that's very much the same and sort of quite earnest and full on. If you come up and you start, like with me, I'll be talking about, you know, quiche, crisps, you know, supermarkets, all that sort of stuff. I think sometimes people quite welcome that as a bit of respite. I don't know whether you'd want sort of 2 hours of it, but, you know, in relief, it's quite welcome, I think. It's almost like a sort of a step towards the audience in a way, which is not something I ever think of myself as doing, but I think, you know, to stand up. And I also realize that, I mean, I'm the good and bad about these things. You know, some people are just like, they're just comic. And remember my dad saying that he saw Leonard Rossiter, you know, from Rising Damp, playing in Jugs Caesar once, and as soon as Leonard Rossiter came on stage, everyone just starts laughing because he's got that face, you know, he's funny, you know, you can't be serious. And I feel I've got a bit of that myself, you know, I can't carry it off, the sort of the dark, brooding, intellectual, you know. It's so, as we're talking about this, there's been a part of me in the past few years think, just accept you're a clown, you know. There's nothing you can do about it. Just stop fighting it, you know. So you can still do other things, but just accept that's what you are, really. And so I've got more comfortable with it. It's just being something that I do, and I think it's something that people respond to. As I said, you know, it's something that people don't expect to find in poetry, and I'm quite happy to find it. Yeah,
it's one of the few good things about getting older, I think. Because I'm thinking about this a lot lately, because I've just turned 40, so I've just made that turn, and I think one of the good things is that you care less about people's perception of you.
Yeah.
No, I certainly took myself a lot more seriously when I was 20 or 25.
Yeah, well, as you should. Yeah, but as you get older, it does change a bit, I think. But there's not much you can do about it, is there? You can't really fight against it, you know. So I think you've just got to accept your destiny.
So let's go back to your origin story, because I'd like to fill in that gap between writing free verse and then doing the more experimental work. Obviously, I can see what you say about prose poetry or flash fiction, and then going from there. But what about constraints? When did you first start experimenting with constraints?
I think I've been writing for quite some time. So there are two phases for my writing, really. Sort of the early stuff in my 20s, when I used to, I suppose I was writing, I mean, I started off writing quite conventional sort of experience-based things, but then I moved on into sort of almost like symbolist sort of, this sounds very pretentious, sort of symbolist, sort of imagist writing. That's what I'm very interested in. And I did a lot of that, and I was sending stuff out to magazines. I got in like very, you know, so I had built up sort of a publication history. Then I came to Manchester to do an MA in creative writing, and that sort of just stopped me really for a couple of years. I found that once I got in that space where you sort of, I suppose it was the wrong time for me maybe to be doing it, but it made me sort of very self-conscious about what I was doing. That's the only thing that stopped me writing over like 30 odd years, 35 years, whatever, 2 children, job changes, house moves, all this stuff. I've never stopped writing, but the only thing that stopped me writing was doing creative writing MA. But when I came back to writing after that, I found, I sort of thought, well, that's it, I'm done with it. Then you can't leave it alone. So I come back to it, but it was different. There'd been some sort of rupture there. And that's when I got more, because the old ways didn't work anymore. The old things that I was doing, I used to write very much, what do they call, stream of consciousness, spontaneous association. I would write very, very quickly, edit very little. And that's the way I did things. And I tried to go back to doing that when I got back to writing again, and found that I was quite bored of my own subconscious, sort of like it wasn't surprising anymore. When you first start to do that type of writing, I think, particularly if you've come out of the sort of English sort of movement tradition of you're writing about real life, you're writing about yourself, you're writing about definite things, and you just let your mind run. You do surrealist techniques. It's a revelation, but then after you've been doing surrealist techniques for a long time, I think your mind has these little grooves it runs down, even if you. So I suppose that element of surprise in myself of having written something that I didn't think I could do was gone. And that's when I started to sort of look for different ways of getting that surprise back, I think. And I mean, not as sort of conscious as that sounds. Another big thing was changing jobs. So I used to teach when I was living here and in Shropshire, near where you are. And then just randomly, I stopped being a teacher, and I came back to Manchester. My wife and I came back to Manchester, and I started to work in IT, which I still do now, sort of database analyst sort of thing, working with sort of date code and stuff like that. And for a while, I thought of those two things as separate. But then I began to think, well, what if you could use this? Because writing code is quite similar in some ways. Database code, in particular, blocks of stuff, form, shape, function. Obviously, you're only interested in writing things that you're very much guided by the utility of what you're doing. So there's no fancy sort of there's no sort of ornamentation. Very sort of similar to the way I used to write poetry. And I began to sort of gradually sort of think, well, the sensibility is not that different. It's quite interesting to explore that sensibility. And what else could you do with this technology? Because it's still an underutilized area, I think, the use of what we can do with technology in poetry. So I became more and more interested in that, in using procedures and stuff like that. And that led to me, well, I did start a PhD in 2012, and that was my PhD thesis, innovative poetry and digital technology. And I was looking at exploring these different things, using different software to write poetry, thinking, of course, that I'd invented it, and he discovered that the first computer poem was written like 1950, so so it's like it's not that new after all. And that's I kept that sort of focus in my PhD, but it came more and more really about using procedures and constraints and the Oulipo, and the digital element sort of it became less important. I became more interested in the rules aspect of it. So I did a few things. I did a book called The Tome of Commencement, which was running the book of Genesis through a spreadsheet and swapping the words in that for synonyms automatically. So that became a book. I did another thing where I ran John Stuart Mill through a SQL database. I did all sorts of stuff like that. And I suppose, it was a combination of sort of intention and opportunity, just working with this stuff all day, every day, and wanting to really sort of seeing the possibility of it also to sort of reclaim something creatively from the day job, which isn't particularly creative. And then finding there was a whole other, like you push a door open that you didn't know was there. There's a whole world of people doing these things that a whole sort of shadow tradition, which you just don't hear about, do you? Just unless you look for it, you would never know it was there. And all sorts of interesting things going on. So that led me to looking at the Oulipo, to conceptualism, to appropriative writing, all those things that sort of go together. So partly just circumstance, really, but I think always looking for that way of surprising yourself, and writing something, producing something that you think after you've written it, you think, well, I didn't know I could do that. And that's what it's all about for me, really. Setting yourself rules and constraints. It's about surprising yourself and pushing yourself.
Yeah, definitely. And it's amazing how many constraint-based poets I meet who are really good with code, because I'm the exception to that rule. I'm shit at it. I can't program anything. But
I'll teach you a bit of SQL Server. That was private SQL Server masterclass.
Yeah, I've just never been good at it, so I'm relying on a few people have sent me sheets of lists that they programmed that show good words to use in anagrams and palindromes, which I hardly ever use, because I find it's really difficult when you create these, or when someone else creates them for you. You still have to sift through it all, trying to find something. And
absolutely, yeah, you
don't have the patience for that.
Yeah, well, with the Bible book, which was the way that worked, is that I split every word. I split the book of Genesis up word by word, and I had a spreadsheet that would randomly swap, synonyms. So put in tome of commencement, obviously book of Genesis, tome for book, commencement for Genesis. But I found you couldn't rely, I could produce multiple versions of it with randomly assigned synonyms, but some were just better than others. So I found myself, I'd retained some from one version, some from another, and edited it, which took longer than, so it took me a while to sort of develop the technological method of doing it, but the editing and the selection was still a huge part of the process. So one of the sort of conclusions I reached in my PhD thesis is that, I think there's lots of digital poetry where using the computer is just seen as being enough. The process is enough. You just let it, you say, here's the output, this is what I've done, look at the interesting procedure that I've developed to do this. But for me, I think the most interesting work is when there's that dialogue between machine or process and person, and there's almost like a collaborative element. And that's what I sort of evolved towards, I think, certainly with the Bible book. I found that if I just let the machine do its work, which would have been easier, it wasn't as good as when I was sort of pushing against it.
Yeah, it wouldn't be as much. It wouldn't be as much you, as we were saying earlier, that your own voice comes through when you're in collaboration with a constraint or collaboration with a machine.
Yeah, almost. I mean, sort of, you're almost in a collaboration with a constraint, aren't you? I mean, so when you're doing your palindromic text, for example, you're sort of working with that, aren't you? It's almost like another partner in the enterprise.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I call it the alien voice. It's which I shouldn't do, because I think people might think I'm being literal and someone's beaming a message down to me. But it is, it's collaboration with this entity that doesn't talk like a normal human being.
Yeah.
And I've got to try and make it talk like a human being, and the end result is something in between.
Yeah. I mean, there's always the thing, the Turing test. Can you make a computer write like it's a human? And I sort of think, well, why would you want to do that? There are like 6 billion, 7 billion humans on the planet that can write like humans. I think it's sort of, there are more interesting things to try and do with a machine, with computers, than that. We can all write like humans, but can a machine make us write like a different human? And that's sort of what that's like 5 years of PhD studies summed up. A glib phrase, but that's the sort of the conclusion that I arrived at. I wasn't just interested in handing control over to a process, whether that is a digital process, a mechanical process, or just a process per se. That I think the interesting thing comes when you have a person working with it. I've been to lots of things. I've been to when I was on the PhD, I went to things like the Electronic Poetry Centre conferences, and there were lots of stuff there that was fantastically technologically impressive. But you'd look at the writing underneath, and it was quite sort of, straightforward, vanilla sort of writing. So it was almost like the technological aspect of it was just window dressing, really. It was just quite ordinary writing with like a veneer of experimental technology, but the experimentalism didn't go through into the work. It wasn't woven through in the work. So that's again sort of what I became interested in. How can you use that machine experimentally? And how can that experimentalism be all the way through the process and all the way through the work, not just that you sort of make a web page to sort of display it differently at the end. You know, it has to be in the very foundation of it.
One thing I find very interesting is that each constraint has its own flavor as well. That if you read a palindrome, you can normally tell it's a palindrome. There's something, there's a certain tone to it, and you get the same thing with pangrams, perhaps for a more obvious reason. That you're going to have all these like X and Q sounds coming up a bit too frequently from what we
the letter frequency is always it's going to be off, isn't it?
So let's talk about this book. How did it come about?
So Catherine and I have known each other. Catherine Vidler, who's obviously the other writer here. She's not here tonight, but she's the other writer. She submitted to my press, Zimzala, in 2016, I think. She sent something called Chain Grass, which is a part of a series of, I don't know, we describe them, they're well worth looking at, as is her work generally. Visual poetry with textual elements, repetitive sort of fugue-like structures, really beautiful work. So I published that in 2016. We sort of had a dialogue around that. And then out of that, we started off collaborating on a text and image project. We had a sort of alternating thing where I would send Catherine an image and she would produce some text. Catherine would send me some text, I would produce an image. And we call that Flip Flop, which is available as PDF, free PDF on my website. And we found that we worked quite well together. That was quite an interesting process that we developed. And then we're looking around for other things to do, to sort of carry on that collaborative relationship. And I mean, Catherine insists it was my idea, but I think it sort of came out of thinking about how we might work together. And one of the things that I found when I was going back to digital technology again, like something with the word substitution for the Book of Genesis, which obviously has been done before, but I was able to use a machine to do it on a much bigger scale. You can do it for a whole book. If you're using a machine to help you rather than just a short piece of text. So obviously pangrams have been done like pretty much forever, but I didn't think anyone had done them on quite such a big scale. But there wasn't any really machine to help us here, but there was another person. So I don't think I could have done a whole pangrammatic novel. Pangrammatic, I don't even know if there's a word we use properly.
I think that works.
Pangrammatical. Yeah, so I don't think there's any way I could have done it on my own. So this is an idea that I sort of developed, and we just talked about we'd explore it and we'd try it out, and it quite quickly took off. And the constraint did. In some ways, it's quite a simple constraint. Well, you just got to use every letter of the alphabet in every sentence. You can describe it very quickly, but actually doing that over a long period of time and a long stretch of text is quite demanding, and it gets more and more complex. And again, that's the sort of, in our case, the third element in the process that very much shapes things. So thinking about, obviously you mentioned there are certain letters that don't occur very often. Z's, X's, Q's, J's are always a difficult one. I was surprised by how difficult it was to get J's into sentences. So
they're very difficult in anagrams. So I think that's probably the same reason.
Yes, I suppose they would be, because they tend to be in certain places in words, don't they? You don't really find many words with like a J in the middle. Can't really think of many major, maybe. So as we sort of developed a novel and we sort of like characters and stories began to emerge, you sort of, because you're looking for the J's, the X's, and the Q's, you end up with people called. You sort of see a character emerging. You think, well, I'll call him Zlatan, because then we've got a Z, and then Zlatan's playing an instrument. What's he playing? Well, we need an X who's playing a saxophone. So Zlatan sort of names that. Well, that's a Swedish Scandinavian name. So all of a sudden, the constraint is invented for you, a Swedish saxophonist. So probably wouldn't have arrived at Swedish sax. And how does he get around? Well, jet ski would be good because that uses the J and the K. So the constraint is then invented for you, a Swedish saxophonist who rides a jet ski. And then later on, we've got birds in here. We've got like Catherine's sort of will always bring an animal in at any opportunity, really. And so we ended up having birds. So we ended up having a quail for the Q, and then we ended up having a castle. I don't even know how you say it. It's an Australian word, cassowary, which is like a big, massive bird, which has a casque on its head. C-A-S-Q-U-E, it's like a hood of skin on its head that gets the Q. So you end up with a big bird and this little bird, and they end up in this sort of, you think, well, the big bird's got to be sort of one way, the little bird's got to be sort of a bit sassy. So you end up with sort of like a mice and men relationship with two birds. And again, that's the sort of constraint that's done that. You ended up with because you want a Q, you've got a little bird, because you want a W, you've got a big bird. And you end up with this weird sort of comedy double act, really. So again, you might have arrived at that separately, but that's the beauty of the rule. It's pushed you into creating these weird characters that then sort of assume a life of their own. And that's what I really like about working with constraints and rules, is that it lets me invent a quail, lets me invent a wisecracking quail. And what's the likelihood of me doing that independently? But maybe I would invent a wisecracking quail. But that's the thing about pushing you and making you do things that you wouldn't otherwise do. Yeah. So we wrote it all the way through. There's another draft of this which has never seen the light of day. So we didn't have anything at the start other than the rule and the story.
So you came up with the characters and the plot as you were going. There wasn't a list that you made beforehand saying here are some good words to use that will eat up.
Not at all. So we didn't do that at all. We mainly did it back and forth over Twitter messaging, and we just sort of kept going with that. And then we ended up with, so the structure was always set that we'd have 26 chapters, one for each letter of the alphabet, 26 sentences in each chapter, each sentence containing all the letters of the alphabet. So that structure was set. So there was an end point, and we just kept going till we got to the end point. And we had a draft, but it wasn't there were lots of things that I would say, there were still loose ends in it. It's by no means got a conventional narrative arc, this book, but there were sort of bits that have been explored and bits that we liked better than others. And it's very hard then to go back and edit it, because you've got this structure, you've got these alternating sentences. So I've written some, Catherine's written some, and of course you've got to maintain the constraint when you go back and edit it. You can't really move stuff about very easily, because you've got to keep the 26 sentences in each chapter. So we decided we're just going to write it again. So we just rewrote it again from the beginning, but with this sort of existing previous draft in our minds. So we had the characters, we had other more characters emerged, and we had some settings. Like Catherine invented this nightclub called the Jiggly Lizard, right? So that was one of her inventions. So that became quite an important thing, which of course is a discotheque because you've got a cue. So we had these settings, we had these characters, we had these birds, we had these Swedes, we had these various people. So the second time around, I don't know whether it was faster, it seemed to take maybe just as long, but we always had this sort of well of things to draw upon. And then we just kept going again. So we wrote all the way through, and we did another 26 chapters. And then we added these other bits, the preface, the epilogue, all these other sort of things around it. But yeah, so we started off with really nothing but the idea of writing a pangrammatic novel. And there's absolutely nothing more than that.
Yeah, that's good. What I like about it is, I think you hinted at this before, the fact that pangrams, that's a constraint associated with brevity, because normally you think, well, it wants it to be as short as possible. So to find a way to write a long pangrammatic novel is very interesting. And then I also like the touch of having the preface, the epilogue, and even your biographies at the end.
Yeah,
obey this constraint. And it's not just your biography and Catherine's, because there is a third person who we haven't mentioned yet.
Yeah, so there's the putative author, Jock Ravishment, whose manuscript this is that Catherine and I discovered and have presented for publication. So he exists too, and he's pangrammatic in his biographical details too. In fact, I think the only thing that isn't pangrammatic in this is Philip Terry's blurb on the back. I didn't think of asking him to do it, but I thought it was a bit much.
What letters are missing?
Well, I don't know. Maybe he has. Maybe I'm doing a disservice there. Maybe he has written a pangrammatic blurb after all. Yeah. So it was quite an undertaking, but it's addictive. You sort of drop into it. And I found myself. I don't know how much Catherine did this. I mean, I sort of cheated a bit. I had a spreadsheet. I've not told her this. I had a spreadsheet where I could put a sentence in, and it would tell me which letters I'd missed. So I was able to sort of. I think Catherine was always just doing it free form counting, finger counting. But mine was sort of like I had a little spreadsheet going where I could drop a sentence in. It would say you're missing typically you're missing a J. So I have to go back and find a J. And I would look at. I've not really discussed it how Catherine did hers, but I would look at word lists and things, Scrabble word lists, and like if I type into my computer now, if I type in W, it'll come up like a search just words containing J and V, or words containing K and X, and I sort of drew upon those really to sort of get things as short as possible and avoid repetition. But I don't think I think Catherine did it more artistically. I don't think she had any mechanistic assistance. I don't think she used word lists either. So Catherine's are a lot more sort of authentic in some ways than mine. I used all sorts of nefarious means to stick to the brief.
Did you have any additional rules? Like, for example, would you say it's no good if this sentence has 100 letters in it because that's too long? Or did you just say, as a general guide, let's try to keep them short?
Yeah. I think we always we never sort of had a stipulation, but I think we've always tried to make them short. I mean, that's a sort of Olympian mission, isn't it? You've got to make life difficult for you. You've got, as Cano said, you've got to build your labyrinth. You're the rat in the labyrinth. You've got to escape from your own labyrinth. So you've got to make your life difficult. So for me, it's always been about sort of, that's been important, trying to sort of stick to the discipline of it. And so we didn't sort of discuss that up front, but we did sort of talk about it as we went along. And the first draft that we had, there were some longer sentences in that. So we certainly tightened up as we went along. You sort of get used to it. And then even now I could probably, you sort of, it's like have some sort of muscle memory. Like if you used to play tennis a lot and you haven't played tennis for 20 years, you can still remember how to play tennis or ride a bike. So I think we sort of developed that style of being able to do it. So no, there were no. The only rule was the one I was saying about having to have every letter in every sentence. But there was that sort of stylistic preference towards brevity, I think. And if you go back to the first draft, it's certainly more sprawling, I would say, than the final.
It's interesting what you say about muscle memory. Do you find now that having written that book, your entire perception of reading has changed? Because as someone who became obsessed with palindromes, it's impossible for me now to read anything without quickly reading it backwards straight after.
Yeah. So you're always on the lookout. I suppose it does, doesn't it? It's sort of like it's sort of like you've got under the hood, haven't you? You sort of you've got down to the sort of mechanics of language. It's sort of like if you've worked in a cafe like I did when I used to work in British Home Stores Cafe, you never look at cafes in the same way again because you know what happens backstage.
Don't tell me.
You never quite look at it. Yeah. You never quite look at it the same way. So I think maybe if you go to that sort of into the kitchens of language, which I suppose is where we spend a lot of our time, where all the sort of linguistic knives and chopping boards and things are kept, then you're always sort of your perception of language is different. You're always looking at it in a more materialistic way. I think you're always looking at it as more. I think most people will really use language quite unconsciously, don't they? I mean, they don't. You wouldn't even think about yourself as using language in ordinary discourse. It's just as I'm talking to you now, I'm not thinking about the fact that I'm talking. I'm just talking.
Yeah, you're not thinking about how many J's you're using.
No, I'm not. But maybe once when it comes to writing, I think you're right. Once you've gone down to that level of detail, once you've sort of taken that blue pill, is it blue pill or red pill? What's the matrix? Is it blue pill? I can't remember.
It's one of them.
Well, you want to take from one of the pills. You can never really look at it in the same way again, can you? I think, yeah, that's true. it does help. We play a lot of bananagrams at home. It does help with that. You play bananagrams? Have you seen that?
Yeah, I can't remember it. I have done them a long time ago.
Yeah, so that's like a word game. We have it's sort of like Scrabble but without a board. You get
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's sort of like writing as bananagrams or Scrabble in some ways. It's sort of like you've got that sort of extra dimension of a technicality to it. Yeah, and perhaps you're right. Maybe it changes your perception forever. Do you find that with other? I mean, you probably work with pangrams a lot, but I mean that's not all that you work with. Do you find that other aspects of your practice sort of affect your perception?
I don't know. Like, do I think in iambic pentameter? Well, that would be quite nice, but I don't think I do. Again, it's more just always being on the lookout for things.
Yeah.
But wherever I am, I don't drive, so I'm the passenger. I have to say this before I say the next thing, because otherwise I sound reckless. So I'm the passenger. And every road sign we go by, I'm always checking to see if that could be used in the palindrome, because I think I know quite a lot of normal words, but I don't know all the place names and how usable they are. So that's another obsession. And anagrams too, same thing. Just always looking at what's usable. Don't know if there's anything more to it than that, really. Just this obsession with the surface qualities.
But place names are very useful in pangrams, and too. There's lots of place names that can get you out of a particular spot. You need a Z urgently. There's always Ashby de la Zouch.
Yeah. Very useful.
Yeah.
So should we have a reading?
Okay. So I'll read from the preface, which, as you said, is pangrammatic, as everything in this book. And it does introduce the concept, and it also introduces the third person who we're talking about, which is Jock Ravishment, who is the true author of the manuscript. So I'll read that. So I'll read at the very start of the book. Preface, in which overlooked novelist Jock Ravishment is biographically introduced and his dizzying textual techniques briefly explicated. Unhappily, little information exists about Jock Ravishment, fez-wearing writer and Highland aquatint artist. Known mostly for being unknown and for his unquenchable fascination with twig lichen, his relatively boozy man of letters and etchings regularly enjoyed a relaxing tipple. Ravishment's headquarters was a clapboard gazebo, his desk flanked by exhausted demijohns. As we eventually zoom in, let us not refrain from imagining the existential sting, both quick and elongated, of Jock's isolation on an especially ordinary Wednesday. Muzzy, sleep-deprived, plagued by grotesque nightmares, Jock felt extremely low. With neither textuals nor picturesques feeling even remotely available to his reach, he proceeded, still in his pajamas, to pour himself a kick-ass tumbler of ouzo. The alphabet, mused Jock, is enduringly wonderful, A to Z, via Q, X, etc. Having adjourned to equip himself with an extra-large musk stick, Ravishment gazed out of the gazebo and into the overgrown garden beyond. Through laungettes, he watched plucky squirrels exuberantly accumulating hazelnuts and felt rejuvenated. 26 letters, no more, no less, murmured Jock, as he popped the last of the piquant pink sweet into his mouth whilst admiring a festive azalea bush. Summarily, the crazed, exquisitely, unforgivingly bonkers project was conceived. On the first night, the full moon swelled to unusual hugeness, exposing Jock Ravishment to a bedazzlingly romantic, virtually unconquerable distraction. Schuriger-esque, bizarre, weird, extraordinary visions tumbled into Jock's fervid perception. The gazebo trembled in a jonquil, fragrant breeze as sweet sentences began quietly, painstakingly to externalize themselves. Jock's overactive mind zinged. Anthropomorphic birds, antique jewelry, Tex-Mex buffets. Feverish yearning surfaced and spilled to travel brazenly between galaxies, to diversify his liquor cabinet, to find true love, to ride a jet ski, to name but a few. I believe, Jock informed a puzzled Yellowhammer, in lexicographical equal opportunities. I feel exactly the same way, I think, sang the Emberizina citronella in vivacious reply, subsequent to a major pause. Without further prevarication, hindquarters inexactly squeezed into a small chair, Jock began. With a gregarious, laser-like focus, interrupted only by excessively frequent breaks for pretzels and beers, he completed the first chapter of his project, then the second. Squinting, the gazebo, inexcusably poorly illuminated, Jock breezed through a weird narrative forming. His fiendishly zany task played joyful havoc with time, which expanded and contracted like obedient bubble gum, no questions asked. After 26 days, benzodrine-driven, the rumour goes, Jock put down his quill. And yet this quirky work still requires illustration and a sizzling title to boot, Jock ravishment whispered, feeling energised beyond exhaustion. However, the novelist's job done, still rocking his quaint fez, promptly expired. A little bit of bread and no cheese, sang the yellow hammer for its position on the branch of an externally adjacent Zelkova serrata, questionably.
Thank you.
Great. There's words in there I never tried to pronounce before.
I'm sorry for putting you on the spot. Yes, I mean, that's the thing. It's going to be difficult to read, surely, with having to get round all those letters too in the short space of time. Also different sounds.
It's an interesting experience to read, actually. It's not really something I've done before. And it does sort of, you're aware that you're reading, and try and just get to the end of each sentence without stumbling, which I did sometimes, but not all the time.
So there is, we have to mention, there's another small aspect to the book, which is the visual poetry that comes at the start of each chapter. Could you describe that?
Yes, so that's a visualization of letter frequency in each chapter. So this is something I've started to do. Again, it's something that I've come up through work that I do. So I'm still working analyst. That's a large aspect of that is visualizing things, using software, making graphs, stuff like that. And I got very interested in doing that creatively. So I've done these things called polka dot texts, which splits which are grids of 100 by 100 dots, and the colours will represent how many letters, what proportion of the text is taken up by each letter. So you have quite a lot of A's, you have a lot of E's, you have 1 dot for X, 1 dot for Y, 1 dot for Z, which when you do a lot of those, it teaches you no matter what text you pick, they're pretty much the same. It's an interesting aspect of it. Even if you do the Mask of Zorro, which I tried to do, which I did, you still end up with hardly any Z's, or they're dwarfed by everything else. So that's one thing I do. I've been doing these sort of spiral texts, which do similar things. And so these visuals that introduce each chapter are the same. So they are like a circular chart with 26 segments, and one for each letter of the alphabet. And the more instances of each letter you have, the wider the segment is. And it's the same chart all the way through, 26 times. But as you move through the chapters, so at the heading of the first chapter, the first segment is shaded. Then in the second chapter, the second segment is shaded all the way through. So you get to the last chapter, and you got the last little sliver of Z shaded. So the act as sort of oblique chapter numbers, but they're based on letter frequency in the whole text, visualized by width of segment. And it's just I think we wanted something that would differentiate the chapters, but we didn't want to break the constraints, because if you start to just put 1, 2, 3, 4, they're outside the parameters then of the novel, aren't they? They're just like these free floating elements. So this was a way of having something visual and also not deviating from the constraint, because they are representing all of the alphabet, because the visualizations of letter frequency in the whole text. They're on message too. So yes, so that's part of quite a few of those things that I've done. Again, as I was saying, it's just I like to use computer software for things it's not meant to be used for. So when they designed Microsoft Excel, I don't think anybody was thinking that this is what you should do for. I quite like that sort of that pushing against something that doesn't really want to do it, and seeing what happens. So yeah, that's the visual. I would say they're oblique visual chapter numbers.
Yeah, it's a very elegant solution, and they're quite striking too. And of course, I've seen other ones you've done for entire novels. What's the weirdest one you found? What's the weirdest novel in terms of the distribution?
Well, there isn't one. That's the thing. It's like no matter what you pick, they always end up pretty much the same. You'll always have E will always be the most common letter.
Have you tried correct?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, so I could try correct, yes. That's yeah. So you just have a sort of you'd have no E's if you did a void, wouldn't you? But no, so I tend to use text off Project Gutenberg, so because they're one of the yeah, well, and digitize as well. One of the prerequisites that you need a digital text really, because you can't be sort of going through typing out a novel. So and it tends to work best with longer ones. So I would say that disappointingly, when you get down to the level of mechanics of language, they're all pretty well, maybe not disappointing, but they're all pretty much the same. You'll always get the same balance. You'll never get more than one dot for a Z. If you do this sort of 100 by 100 grid, you never get more than one dot for a Z, never get more than one dot for an X, no matter what you put through. I think it's called Zipf's law, which is like which sort of says that letter distribution will always be the same, no matter what the text, unless you change languages, of course. But I decided not to do that. I would stick with doing English. So yeah, I would say the weird thing about it is there are no weird results. You'd expect there to be, wouldn't you? You'd expect them.
Yeah. That's interesting in itself.
Yeah. And so that's I started off doing the polka dot things, and I sort of stopped doing them after a while because they all look the same. So I moved on to other ones. A part of it was just that I use this software Tableau at work, which is like a data visualization software. And I watch all these YouTube things about people making these visualizations. I thought, well, I can really, I can use that in a completely unintentional way. So a lot of it is opportunistic. It's sort of like, well, I knew how to do these little dot charts. I thought, well, that'll be interesting. I'll just try and sort of subvert those a bit. So yeah, the dots sort of end up being a bit repetitive. So I've done some other things. There's text spirals. You've seen the text spirals, I think, which sort of show the letter frequency by chapter, sort of spiraling out from the center of a book. I've done these other things where I've sort of like I've picked out certain words, like I did one of the ones I did that people seem to like a lot, certainly on social media, was the visualization I did of Moby Dick, where it was sort of I think I did 1,000 by 1,000, split the book into like a 10,000 segments, and each segment that mentioned the word whale I picked out in white, like it was a little bubble on a background of blue. And that's a surprising thing, I think, for people who haven't read the book, is how little whale there is in Moby Dick. You'd expect it to be whale all the time, but it's not. There are long stretches when you read it. There are long stretches where there's no sign of a whale. So that's sort of when something I tend to think that works quite well when people sort of look at that and sort of think, well, that's interesting. And also, where are all the whales in Moby Dick? I did another one for peeps. I mentioned I picked out all the ones all the mentions of plague and fire. So plague in a black circle, fire in an orange circle. So you get large swathes of nothing where there's no plague and there's no fire. Then there's a plague, then there's a fire, then there's no plague and no fire anymore. Apart from when he remembers back to it. So perhaps maybe sort of doing something like that produces more interesting results, and that when I've done a lot of these polka dot texts, you think, well, it's just going to end up looking like, I know what it's going to end up looking like, but I think when I did this thing today with peeps, I thought, well, I don't really know what it's going to look like. So again, it's sort of pushing out and trying to surprise yourself, and push and produce things that are unexpected for you. But I've never done anything. I've never used these little circles for anything other than this book. It just seemed to be where they belonged.
Yeah, it's all very interesting, and it brings us back to where we were before, talking about emphasizing the surface qualities of a text rather than its meaning. But of course, that in itself brings about meaning. That you've noticed that the whales don't appear too much in Moby Dick. Well, that's meaningful, isn't it? That shows that tells us something.
Yeah, it's a commentary, isn't it? Visual commentary. I sort of think of it sometimes as translations. It's sort of like I'm just putting the book into another language. I'm putting it into a language that has no words. I'm translating it visually. which is sometimes what I call them visual translations. And yeah, it does illuminate. I think when they work well, they don't always work. You know, it's hard. It's hard to think of things to do it with. So, like with Moby Dick, you know, you know, there's that thing that I knew beforehand that there aren't many whales in Moby Dick, and I thought that'd be quite interesting. And I knew before from Pepys, because it's such a long book, there are long stretches where everybody thinks about Pepys and the Fire of London and the Plague. But you know, there are long stretches where none of that is happening. So I was sort of aware of that. I've tried with other books, like I've tried mentioning picking out all the mentions of blood in Dracula, but there's quite a lot of blood in Dracula.
I imagine.
You know, Pepys obviously is massive, so you get these sort of many sort of granular segments to it, but you don't get that with Dracula. You know, pretty much every segment's got something in there, some mention of blood in there. So yeah, the challenge is having sort of developed this way of doing things is for it not just to be sort of nice looking visuals, which is where they started off with. I've seen people doing things like this with, you know, computer software, with Tableau, as I was talking about, things like that, and producing things that just look nice and trying to make them sort of in some way interesting. So that the hard part is not actually having developed the procedure. I can just plug it in and I can produce it 5 minutes really, but thinking about what to do it on and how to do it is the hard part. And so in terms of that sort of picking out the word frequency, I've only really done those two. I've never really been able to think of anything else that would make sense to do. Likewise with the spirals as well, you know, you sort of think, well, I could put any text in a spiral, but the one that I think you've seen is the one of Dante, so Inferno, Paradise, and Purgatory, and that spiral makes sense for that because it's circles, you know, the circles of hell. So the structure fits with it. But I could put anything in that spiral pattern, but then the spiral wouldn't make any sense. So it's again, it's that dialogue with the procedure, and the procedure itself not being enough. That there has to be your input into it. There has to be a selection. There has to be a reason to do it, I think.
Yeah, and that marriage of subjects and form is always interesting. I think with Constraint as well, it's something to always look for.
Yeah, the form is easy for these. The subject is harder. Whereas with the Pangram book, the form drove, as we're saying, the form drove the subject. There was no subject. We just started with the form, and that produced that effectively was like an algorithm that produced the subject for us. So it's interesting how the constraint can work in almost different directions, you know, depending on what the constraint is.
Yeah, definitely. So Pack My Box with 5 dozen liquor jugs is out. Well, it's going to be out today, because today I mean Saturday, which is when this podcast is going out. So it's out now and available from penteractpress.com. So you have this book out today. What's next for you?
Well, actually, having not had a book out for 3 years, I've now got 2 out in 3 weeks. So there's a pamphlet. I've got a pamphlet, sort of a more sort of written stuff, not a constraint-based pamphlet, coming out with Bare Bow Press, which is at the end of this month. That's coming out the 25th of November. So that's my next creative thing. I'm trying to do more with these visual things that I was talking about. There's been sort of tentative talk about doing a book of those. So I think maybe my next project will be to pull those together into some sort of meaningful form. There's Zimzala, which is my press as well. I've got a few
yes, we haven't had time to talk about that, but that's obviously a huge part of your practice.
Yeah, well, we've got an event coming up soon, on the 14th of November. So first real life event that I've hosted for a long time. And I'm going to be belatedly launching Index, which is a set of collage poem cards by Sophie Herxheimer. So we're going to be late. That's been out for 6 months, but we never had the opportunity to do anything other than we've done a virtual launch. But we want to do a real life launch. So that's that coming up. So that should be interesting. Be good to get out and do something again. And other than that, it's just keeping writing, keeping publishing, really.
Yeah, and why not? More ideas, more objects, more creativity.
Yeah, that's the plan, such as it is.
Tom, thank you so much. It's been great to see you.
Well, thank you, and thanks for publishing, and thanks for inviting me to talk about it tonight.
To discover more, visit us at penteractpress.com.